So thank you once again, Pedro, for accepting our invitation. Pedro is a reader at Birkbeck University of London. He was previously, actually, he just mentioned it, for 7 years at the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. He received his PhD in 2010 from the London School of Economics. His supervisor was actually the Nobel Prize winner, Pisarides. And he continues working on the topics of macroeconomics and labor, and is interested in search and matching models, and he particularly work on topics such as mismatch and public employment. And today is actually talking, is actually presenting a paper in which he includes both public employment and mismatch. So we are actually very keen in hearing from you. So I'm gonna stop sharing now my screen. I'm gonna allow you to share your screen and to start with your presentation.
I mean, let me just mention that we are directly broadcasting from the lecture room of Panmure House. So enjoy, Pedro. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words. I hope you can hear me well and that you see the slides. This is joint work with Pietro Garibaldi and Peptide Soprazo. Okay, so I've been working on public sector employment for about more than 10 years, and I find it's very important and under-researched topics in macroeconomics. And it's important whether you look at the labor market. So if you go to the labor market in OECD countries, between 15 to 30% of employment is employment in the public sector. So it's very sizable from a labor market perspective, but also from a fiscal perspective. So the majority of government consumption expenditures is actually with a public sector wage bill. In the US, for instance, the government spends 60% more in compensation of general government employees than on purchase of intermediate goods. So macroeconomists, when they think about G, it's the large majority is with the public sector wage bill. So it's important from the fiscal perspective, from the labor market perspective, but in real economies as well. So, you know, every year the decision, one of the most important decisions governments do is how much they are going to increase public sector workers. It has a lot of political debate. It was important during the euro area crisis, where a lot of measures were pertaining to public sector workers' pay and headcount. And it's important now during the COVID pandemic, both because it feels that you want to have good public services, and the frontline workers are public sector workers, but also in the aftermath with very high government debts, it will place an important question on how much these services cost. So one of the key dimensions that I think is very important, there are different dimensions of heterogeneity in public sector employment along various dimensions. This paper is about one dimension, which is education. So when you go, for instance, this is US data, and it tells us the share of public employment out of total employment for different groups of workers with different levels of education. And what you see is that the government hires very few people with low education, and it increases and it hires 1/3 of all workers with a PhD or with a MSc degree in the US. So there is this education bias. The government hires more. The importance of government as an employer increases with education. Now, whenever you go on studying public sector labor markets, you'll always have this duality that you can't separate what is headcount, so what is employment, and what is the wage, how much you are paying to the different workers, and these are come hand in hand. And usually we use micro level estimations of the public sector wage premium. So we go to very narrow defined categories. We control for many observables and sometimes for selection or different econometric methods. But in general, to isolate comparable workers in the public sector, how much they earn more or less than in the private. And this is one overwhelming fact that's stylized, that there is this wage compression. Public sector workers with lower education have very high premium of working in the public sectors relative to the private, and then the more you progress in the education, the level of education, this premium is smaller and it becomes negative. Then it will depend on the countries and data samples, the time period, but in general there's this compression. Okay, so with this, our main question of this paper is trying to understand why is this. So why does the government hire so many educated workers? And it might sound very good at the first instance. You want the public sector to be, to employ the very best, to be, provide very good services. But when we have a macroeconomic perspective, we have to understand that if you are taking skilled workers, more educated workers, it's one fewer worker available in the private sector. So what I mean is that the skill mix that the government chooses, it has an impact one-to-one, at least with other factors might play a role for other adjustments, but the basic adjustment is about affecting the skill mix in the private sector. So it's important to understand whether this hiring too many educated workers is something benign, or it's something less benign. So we are going to have three explanations. And the first explanation, I think it's the one in everyone's mind, that whatever the services the government provides, it might need more educated worker, might be more important inputs in the production of these services. So you think about healthcare, about education, about bureaucracy. You want to run good civil service, they might just require more educated workers. So we call this a technological explanation. It's really related to the services that the government provides. And this is very benign. No, this is a very good, if the government, the services that the government provides needs more educated workers, then this is fine. Now we have two other explanations. And the second one relates to the fact that the wages are compressed. And if you think about a government that has some degree of optimality in, for instance, minimizing costs, the fact that you pay more to these unskilled workers is going to shift demands from these workers from the government. So if they are relatively too expensive, they'll prefer to hire workers with more qualifications to which they pay relatively less. So this compressed wage schedule that we can attribute to other, I'll talk about this, where this can come from, but from unions or political economy stories, it might just bias this demand of which workers the government hires. And if it pays too much to at the bottom, it will just, the government will shy away. When you are running a department, you just see, I will open a vacancy higher up because it's just too much relative to these workers' productivity. And the third explanation is related to this. If the government is paying very high wages relative to the private sector, to the workers in low-skilled occupations, what happens, it might generate underemployment. Or sometimes it's called overeducation in the mismatch literature, which just means that you'll be hiring someone with a college degree to work in a low-skilled occupation. So this might bias. So this might seem that the government hires many college graduates, but then if they are working in an unskilled occupation in the public sector, then it's a waste of skills. So we want to distinguish between these three explanations and then see the implications of these last two, the wage compression in the public sector. So in the paper, we do three things. So the first one is document empirical evidence for the US, UK, France, and Spain using microdata on this main fact that this public sector education bias along different dimensions, so age, gender, region, or over time. And then we'll go to each one of these possible explanations. So I'll give you evidence of public sector education bias by industry and occupation within the public and private sector. Public-private wage differential, so this wage compression by education, and underemployment of college graduates and how it compares in the public and the private sector. So the first part is just to set these facts. The second part is to develop a simple model, and it's a two-sector model, so it has public and private sector, and we allow for underemployment. The model itself is going to be very simple. It's at the end, it boils down to one equation to one unknown. So it really builds just on conceptually on these issues. And we think it's very important conceptually to think about what are public sector labor markets and what's the difference between public sector labor markets from private sector labor markets. And this is how we view it. We think about the private sector as a competitive labor market. We call it Valrasian, where wages adjust to equate demand and supply, and there is the Valrasian auctioneer that makes sure of that. On the public sector, we think about a cost minimizing government, but that has a wage schedule that does not equate demand and supply. And we call it a Malinvo government. And the idea that the wage schedule doesn't adjust it comes from two reasons. So one is there's the same adjustment mechanisms that we think about the private sector do not exist in the public sector. So if the government is paying too much to its work to the workers, it's not that another government comes and undercuts and tries to sell the price at the cheaper goods, as we imagine for the private sector, because the government doesn't sell the production. It supplies it for free and it finances with taxes. So this idea of competition that drives the wage to an equilibrium, you can't really think that you have the same mechanisms in the public sector. And then what's a very substantial literature in the 70s and 80s from Musgrave or Buchanan or Becker, they pointed out that the government uses the wage policies to achieve many different objectives outside of the labor market. So to satisfy unions, to win elections, to promote rent-seeking. Alessina talked about how the government uses wage policies to achieve redistribution. So these are all things that are outside of the labor market. So in that sense, when we are going to look at the labor market, it can either be one of two things. Either the government is setting wages that are above the market clearing, and in that case, the government is paying too much. So that means that supply is larger than demand. The government wants to open 10 jobs, and 20 people want to work in the government. So employment is demand determined, and then people that don't get a job go elsewhere. On the other hand, it might be too low wages. And in that case, employment is supply determined. What does this mean? The government opens 10 jobs, but it's not paying enough. So not only 5 people want to come into the public sector, and the government can't fill the jobs. And we think that this is really the essence of the public sector labor markets, and that these two situations actually can coexist for different types of workers. So this is kind of the key idea of the model and how we think about the public sector labor market. And then we have the introduction of underemployment. And here it's very simple. It's just thinking that workers with high education, they do skilled jobs, but they can also do unskilled jobs. On workers with low education, they do unskilled jobs, but they can't perform skilled jobs. So I worked when I was younger at a hotel serving breakfast. I could still do it. It's in my choice set. It's feasible. It's not feasible for someone that's the cook in the hotel I worked. He can't give my lectures at Workback. So it's just a matter of feasibility. And then what we do, we introduce a variation of the ROI model where people have different, you can think about either a non-pecuniary value of jobs or a cost of particular jobs. And because of this, you might not choose the highest paying job. And this double variation of the ROI model allows you to get both generate underemployment and allow for different wages in the public and private sector. But the idea is I might not choose a public sector job, even if it pays more, if it's very costly for me because I have to move town. So it's a shortcut for potentially different frictions. So the third part, then we have the model. And then we do this decomposition, try to see how much is important are the wages, this wage compression and excess underemployment. And we find that technology is the main driver. And I think that's natural to think, but still the wage compression and excess underemployment explain up to 15% of the education bias. With this, then we go on analyzing what are the implications of this wage compression. And what we think are the main implications are for the most surprising, let's say, it's on private sector inequality. So there is this idea, at least during the euro crisis, a lot of countries had to cut public sector wages, and they cut wages for the highest earners, and they protect the lowest earners from cuts. And the idea was because of inequality. Now, what we show is that this policy can actually backfire. So suppose that the government increases the wages of the unskilled public sector jobs, so the lowest earners in the public sector. What happens is that there is an adjustment of the type of workers the government hires. If you are managing a department, and now these workers are much more expensive, you prefer to hire workers that are more skilled, and you substitute tasks and you won't hire. So what happens is the government will hire fewer unskilled workers that go to the private sector, and they will try to hire more skilled workers that are relatively cheaper. And because of this, what happens in the private sector, you have more supply of unskilled workers, and you have fewer skilled workers, so it increases the inequality in the private sector. And this comes from this general equilibrium idea, and I think it's unexpected result, but I think it's very important conceptually that there is these adjustments, and the government protecting a subset of workers actually might increase inequality for the rest of the economy. So I'll be quick on the literature. I've approached public sector employment from a search and matching perspective. And the search and matching allows you to study many things like job security, and I've worked on different topics on gender and on age and nepotism in the public sector. But for this paper, we try to study these implications of the public sector in general equilibrium. I think it's more clearly studied without search and employment. So our framework is going to be different, and I'm going to depart from my own previous work. And it's also related to this literature in the 70s of the fixed price equilibrium and models with rationing, which were original models to think about unemployment in the economy. but then they were kind of overtaken by the search unemployment theories. But we do think that this idea of fixed price or fixed wage, or meaning that a wage that doesn't necessarily equate demand and supply, we think it's not really suitable for the private sector, but it's a good way to describe the public sector labor market. So I don't know if this might be
Pedro, would you like to take in a couple of questions
yes.
before you continue, or I don't want to interrupt you, but just if you feel that you need to
it's
share
the best
more,
time because I kind of finished the introduction and then I'll go on the data, then I can take questions, and then on the model, and then
okay, that's great. So there was a question here which one of the attendees raised. Chris, would you like to ask your question, or would you like me to do it for you?
No, I'm very happy to take questions now, and even
okay.
Hi there, thank you very much.
Hi.
I just want to say, kind of preface this, I think it's a really interesting topic, and not one I've seen studied rigorously before, so it's nice to see some work on it. I just wanted to ask, so you raised a couple of, or you seem to be focusing on 3 specific mechanisms. I just wondered, you're about to get onto the data. Is it not the case that individuals who are very well qualified and who may accept or be accepted for positions at the top of government or benefit from a prestige associated with those positions? They're positions which, affords the individuals a high degree of autonomy. They are given a great deal of power and influence, and that experience is definitely beneficial for them in other, in other jobs that they take. So I wonder if that prestige helps to explain, in your view, that that negative premium for well-qualified individuals, and I wonder to what extent you're accounting for that in your work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So there is, I think it's a very good question. So there are 2 dimensions of when we talked about skilled public sector workers, let's say skilled, or there's always kind of 2 things we have to distinguish. One is what is observable, so think about education, and then what is unobservable, think about ability. And it's important because in a way the government can select based on education when it posts a position that requires a certain level of study, but it's on the ability. It's an observable, and it's out of the control of the government. So it's not so much about demand; it's more about the supply of the best workers wants to go or not. But it's kind of a very kind of a different. 2 different things. Now, on your specific question, it's true, and it's very important to distinguish what is compensation in the public sector from the wage. Wage is only one part of the compensation, and a lot of my previous works tries to account what's the value of other sources of compensation. So job security, you have better pensions, you have better work-life balance. And certainly what you mentioned, these prestige can be important for some situations. From some literature talks about a stigma of public sector workers. It might be at different levels, but here there could be different views. So some people might feel a stigma from working in the public sector. Certainly, you might benefit from the work. Other people talk about just a pure preference. So in the model, there's going to be a component that is idiosyncratic. So a value or a cost of given jobs. In this case, it's going to be idiosyncratic. So the mean is 0. But some people will feel kind of an attraction to the public sector, and some people would attribute, have a distaste. So I will have that in the, but I won't make the assumption that this will be, this value is going to be positive on average for everyone. I'm going to say it varies how much you value this might be different for different people. Now, in the model itself, I only consider wages because it's more like a model to illustrate a mechanism. But certainly, when you have more in practice, what it's important when you think about compensation to public sector workers, it's not only about this, let's call it naive wage comparisons, but it's to try to quantify these other compensating benefits. And here I think this prestige wouldn't be the first one. So job security would be one, the pensions would be other, and the work-life balance, the fact that you work fewer hours on average in the public sector, those would be kind of the main, when you really think about influencing policymakers to set public sector wages properly, you would think first on those dimensions. But you are absolutely right on the question, and it's a good point. For some people, it does work.
I wonder, would it be okay if I just quickly added? Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time. Atanas, Christian.
I mean, just go ahead. It's fine. Okay. But I think I want to kind of let Pedro run through the model, and then we can have another set of questions.
So just very quickly, one of the things that I was thinking about there is that it's kind of an investment for workers who are well qualified. That say take Spencer Dale, for example, ex-chief economist of the Bank of England, having that's an extreme example, but having held the position that he had in the public sector, he was able to go on and find very, very well remunerated private sector work. And I wonder to what extent that this choice to work in the public sector is an investment on the part of the workers themselves. And,
yes, so I can add something on that. So there are some papers talking about the revolving doors. So this, you have a job in the government, and then you use it to get kind of a position in the advisor in the big company, but so there is that literature. What I think is it's very limited to the really very few top positions. So it might be important, but the question is whether it makes sense for when we think about public employment in general. And there, when we go to the data on labor market flows, so you go to survey data and you see the movements between public employment, private employment, unemployment, and inactivity, and you find that there are very few direct transitions between public and private sector. Every quarter as a matter of substance. Now you'll always find these, the ones that move, you probably would find them on the very top, and it might be important to kind of analyze this micro labor market, but as a matter of substance of the whole public sector, I wouldn't put it as a first, as a first order importance.
That's right. Thank you very much.
When you go to the data, you see that in general public sector employment, there's much lower turnover. So it's 1/3 of that in the private sector. So you go and then you say you don't, jobs are safer, so you don't move to unemployment or to inactivity, or not as much as in the private sector. So it's and you don't have these transitions, so many transitions between public and private as a whole. So if I could go on, but I'll stop now. I'll run quickly over the facts, and then we can stop again before going to the model. Now, when we go to the facts, we try to have an accounting kind of a framework to think about it, and we think in a 2x2 matrix. So public sector and private sector, and then either you have at least college and no college. So what we are doing, instead of looking at all these different categories, we do this binary college, non-college, because that's how we are going to map it into the simple model. So we think about N as the total number of people with college, the percentage of population with college, and then we use this 1 for the people with college and 2 for people with no college, and then G for government and P for private sector. And what we can do two statistics to summarize this education bias. One is the ratio of public employment shares, which is just what's the fraction of public employment in college over the fraction of public employment in no college. And we can look about it in columns rather than rows, which is the education intensity ratio. So it's asking what's the fraction of public sector workers that have college divided by the fraction of private sector workers that have college. And why these two statistics are interesting, that if in a symmetric world, they would be one. So in a world where the government would always have the same skill mix as in the private sector, these would be one. So one is kind of the benchmark that we want to think about. So this is data from UK, France, and Spain labor force surveys, and then the US CPS. And here you have just the public employment shares for people with college, at least college, and without college. And we see this education bias. So in the or education over representation, let's say. So in the UK, for instance, 37 people of all college graduates are working in the public sector. And in Spain, you also find this big gap, US and France. And the graph on the right is the college employment share by sector. So it's just the other side of the coin. So this just tells you that, in the US, in Spain and the UK, more than 50% of all workers in the public sector have at least a college degree. And this is how, when we divide each of the bars by the second, then we have these two statistics, and we see that it's larger than one for all countries. It's about 2 in the US and the UK, and it's close to 3 in Spain. It's a bit less in France. So this is for the whole economy. Then we do by gender. I'll go quickly because it's just by gender, by age, by different. This is different states in the US, and you see it varies a lot across different US states from 1.4 to 3, but it's there in each of the 52 states, and it's over time. Now, our first idea was about technology. So can all this be accounted by the types of services that the government provides? And here we do 2 separations. One is by looking at industry, and in particular health and education. So we are going to separate what is health and education from the rest. And you can see, for instance, here in the UK, the public employment share in education is about 70 to 80%. So 70% of workers in education are working in the public sector. But what we see is that even when you take out the health and education, you still have a substantial public employment bias. But even within these narrow industries, education or health, in all the countries, US, UK, and France, you still have that bias within the industry. So it's not just a matter of what the government is producing, is something more. And that you also see very clearly when we go in the US to 3-digit occupations. So these are really narrow defined occupations that are common between the public and the private sector. So let's say office cleaners. And we can see so you go to this narrow defined category and you look, so 3-digit occupation, and you look at the ratio of college graduates in the public and the private sector. And you see that in more than 2/3 of all these common occupations, the public sector has a higher education bias. So this ratio of public employment shares is larger than 1 in more than 2/3 of these occupations. So it's certainly important, and I think in the end we'll see, and it's it's very important is what the government is producing. But even on top of that, there's something else, And that's where we think it's this wage compression and the skill mix the government chooses, and the underemployment is important. Now, on the public sector wage premium, there are many papers that estimate with very advanced econometric tools, accounting for selection, doing different decompositions. They all find that the premium is larger for workers with lower education. We run our own regressions with the simplest method to estimate the premium is just adding a dummy to a Mincer regression, but just to have numbers that we'll then use in the model. And we find that the premium in the US for workers with no college is about 8%, and it's about 1% for workers with college. But then bear in mind that, on top of this, there's more heterogeneity, as we've seen with college, or what is workers with masters or a PhD. We also do it for the other countries, and it's always there. You can see it's really large, substantially large in Spain, and it can change over time. For instance, during the euro area crisis. And when you go to different US states, this wage compression is there, except in only one state, and it can be as large as 15 percentage points, so 15 log points. And this, on the left-hand side, you see this variation. And I think this is one of the most important elements when you go to across countries or within country. There is huge variation on the public sector wage policies, even within country. Okay, now going to underemployment, and I know many of you work on underemployment, and I have this quote, and I took from a paper by Hieronymicalos and Kospentaris, and I find it amazing. So it's about some openings at the Bank of Italy, and it says, it's from a newspaper article, and it says, Italy's chronic unemployment problem has been thrown into sharp relief after 85,000 people applied for 30 jobs at the Bank of Italy. The work is not glamorous. One duty is to feed notes into a machine that can distinguish banknotes that are counterfeit or so worn out that they should be no longer in circulation. The Bank of Italy whittled down the applicants to a short list of 8,000, all of them first-class graduates with a solid academic record. They will have to sit in grueling examination in which they'll be tested in statistics, mathematics, economics, and English. And the high level of interest was a reflection of the state of the economy, but also the Italian obsession with securing a permanent job. So this hints at many things about the public sector, but one of them is this idea of underemployment, that because these jobs are so good, either because the wages, but also these other things that we've talked about. So job security in Italy definitely would be one at the top level. Because of this, then it attracts people with better qualifications to do an unskilled job. And because how the government works, that it ranks applicants. It is going to hire always the best person. This is a huge waste of both resources of the government in doing the triage and in selecting, and also it's the end, the person that's going to do this, it's going to be underemployed. It's going to be a waste of resources. Now when we can go to the data to try to find a bit more evidence of this. Already using the CPS, we can go to these 3-digit occupations, and here I plotted this ratio of employment share, so our statistic, and the no college public sector wage premium. So that means in that occupation, people without college, how much they earn more in the public relative to the private. And what you see, this positive correlation. So in the occupations where the public sector is paying a lot to people without college relative to the private, you have the government is hiring more, a higher fraction of college workers. So this could be something like food and related product machine operators, the office cleaners, or mobile plant operators. So this is especially these top ones, are unskilled unskilled tasks. Now, we do go to more evidence on across country, but to that I'll just do again a bit of accounting, and it's going to help in the model. So we are going to think about you as the stock of workers with college degree, but that are working in occupations that are mainly performed by non-college workers. Okay, and N is still the percentage of people with college, but now we have to distinguish what is jobs and workers, because they might be doing different, workers might be having different jobs. So we think about J1 as the stock of jobs in graduate related tasks, so the top jobs, and these will be filled by everyone that has college that are not underemployed, so N minus U. And the stocks of jobs in non-graduate related tasks, so the bottom jobs, they will be filled by people without college, but plus the college workers that are working there. And we do this because we can define an underemployment rate. Please do not confuse it with unemployment rate. It's underemployment rate, where you just put the fraction of unskilled jobs that are performed by college workers. And we do it in this way because then it's symmetric and you can calculate for both private and public. Now, underemployment is much wider than the public sector. So just to give you a number, in the US, there are 5 million waitresses and waiters, and 1 million of them have a college degree. Okay, so it's really a wider issue. But what we do, we go to PIAC data, which is the main data that researchers are using to study underemployment. We calculate underemployment following the same methodology as the OECD, but we can show you the underemployment rates for different countries. But in particularly, the graph in the right shows what is the underemployment in the public and private sector. And we can see three things. First, it varies a lot across countries. For the majority of countries, 70% of them, it's higher in the public sector. And the difference is particularly large in these countries like Spain or Italy. Italy that have this case of the Banca d'Italia. But it's not inevitable. So there are countries, Nordic countries, Finland, or even France, in which the underemployment rate is lower in the public sector. So it's not inevitable, but for the large majority of countries, including the US and UK and Southern European countries, it seems to be more pervasive in the public sector. So I think we can maybe have another set of questions if there are, before I move to the final part with the unemployment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Pedro. I'm really looking forward to the model and kind of to dig into the details. But there are a couple of very quick questions. Perhaps I would like Arnab, if he wants to elevate and kind of unmute himself, he can ask the question, or I can kind of summarize them briefly and we can move on. Arnab.
Either way, Athanas.
Okay,
but
go ahead.
Two kind of questions. So I'm slightly curious as to what you mean by public sector. And the reason I ask is, I have lived in places where, the garbage collection is done by private contractors. We also live in societies where many people feel that, kind of the government should be small and lean and only perform high value-added services. So maybe that is one of the reasons. So that's one question. Having said that, so we were doing some work around the COVID crisis recently, and it turns out that one of the places which is most heavily affected in Britain is the Southeast. And the reason is that there are much larger proportion of low value-added government services in the Southeast. You can think of the reasons why that might be the case, but so that's the counterpoint. Also following on from Chris's earlier point, the point is not so much whether some people in government can then go and land a highly coveted job in the private sector. It is that if you have a rational expectations kind of setting, and even if you have a small probability of somebody being able to do that, then it is taken into the decision-making process of all agents, and therefore can change everybody's behavior. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me, I'll answer the question on the data, on the definition of public sector, and I'll postpone, because you're absolutely right. The idea, when you make decisions, it's all about the future, and then you incorporate all different possible cases, and that matters. So that's one way to view what's the different compensations. That's why public sector pays higher retirement benefits, so that matters as well in your decision. But I'll leave that for the end, if you don't mind. I'll answer the one on the public sector, the definition, and here it's very hard. There are different dimensions of the public sector. So you have a core, which is civil servants. You have sometimes frontline providers, for example, the NHS. And then you have we have to distinguish what is public provision of the good and public production of the good. So the government might decide, I want to provide for free, let's say, health, but they might contract the private sector, or they want to do the cleaning and then outsource this the garbage.
Exactly my point.
So these won't be public sector workers. These would be out. So in the end, sometimes it really boils down to the data set that you have. And different papers, depending on the data set, use slightly different definitions. But the point is, it's kind of, there are gray areas. But if to tell you, in the US, the CPS definition, which is the official, it tells government employees, and these are all self-reported. So in the US is, I'm a government employee, either federal, state, or local government. In the UK, you are asked if you are NHS civil servant, work for a local government. So these are all self-reported definitions. The same for Spain and France. So what I can tell you is, in our definitions, is it's consistent with how the statistics are done. But let me illustrate, for example, the Federal Reserve. We always know people working in the Fed. If you are working for the board in Washington, you are a federal worker. Now, if you are working for one of the regional Feds, it turns out that legally they are not federal employees. They are they have a mixed legal status between public and private. So legally, they are not federal workers. Now, but when Trump, you had the government shut down and the federal workers couldn't be hired, they legally were not bind to that, but they voluntarily complied. So first of all, I don't know how federal workers will feel in the CPS to tell if they are government workers or not. But even if they are not, and they are not legally they are in the sphere of the public sector. So what I think about it as different spheres, and you have Mercury and Venus that are very close to the sun, so they are clearly public sector, so civil servants. But then you have kind of different layers that are further apart, but they still fall in the influence of the public sector. At some point, it's a data question, and then you do a cutoff, and then that will depend on the type of data that you have. But it's by far not very clear. It's not a precise definition. Yeah. So and I'll talk a little bit about this public. What is the provision of public goods and the decision to outsource, but maybe at the end. So I don't know if I answered your question.
That is good enough to proceed.
Yeah, we probably should go ahead, Pedro, because you have about 20 minutes or so, and I'd like to see the model. But there are a few questions we can hold off until the end of the presentation.
You'll see that the model.
Thanks, Arno.
it's going to be easy. So I note the 20 minutes. So think about a 101 labor economics textbook model, where you have two types of workers, and that have higher education, and 1-N that don't. And then you have jobs, and usually we call skilled jobs and unskilled jobs. And what we always do, or in the textbook model, is to do a one-to-one mapping between workers that are educated with the skill of the job. We call them skilled workers, skilled jobs. There's a one-to-one mapping. Now, we are going to make two generalizations to this basic model. And one is to add the public sector. So now educated workers can choose either a skilled job in the private sector or a non-skilled job, skilled job in the public sector. And the difference here, and why it's not just a purely two-sector model, is first, there is no price for the second sector. And then the second one is this: the labor market will work differently. So in the private sector, there will be the Walrasian market, as we are used to, where wages are going to adjust to equate demand and supply. But in the public sector, the wages are coming from outside of the model because of political economy or unions, and do not adjust to equate demand and supply. And then we'll analyze how would that labor market work, and how would that feed back into the private sector. The second generalization is adding underemployment. So it's just saying that it's in the production possibility set that an educated worker might decide to do, as we see in real economies, might actually do an unskilled job. And just this version, we have another paper. I was actually in between presenting this one or the other one, this output costs of mismatch. We just focus on the private sector, and we just develop a bit the model, also considering overemployment and different wages. But for the purpose of this paper, we just allow this, that an educated worker might choose to be underemployed, and we'll see why he would actually want to do it. So in the end, this is the setting. If you have education, you have four options. Either you'll be employed in the public or private in a skill job, or you'll be underemployed in either the public or private. If you don't have higher education, you can only move into the public or private sector. So the top ones have four choices, and the bottom ones have two choices. Okay, so on technology, we just consider a Cobb-Douglas production in the private sector and in the public sector. Here it's important that the public sector produces a different good, and there's no market price for public sector services. And we just consider Cobb-Douglas. We do a CES in the appendix, but just we really want to keep simple, and the CES doesn't bring anything, any particularly new insight. What here the importance is that these they have different coefficients. In the public sector, it has a coefficient beta, and the private sector has coefficient alpha. And this beta and alpha, this beta is going to tell us how more important educated workers are in the production of public sector services. So this is the technology explanation. And again, 1 for the top and 2 for the unskilled jobs or workers, and P stands for private and G for government for the public sector. Okay, so the model is static, and here is, so we are going to introduce what is the pecuniary aspect, the wage aspect of a job, and that's going to be the net wage. And it could be different in the public and private sector and for skilled and unskilled jobs. But then we are going to include it's a non-pecuniary value or an additional cost to these jobs. And these are idiosyncratic. So each person draws one from an extreme type 1 error distribution for each skilled and unskilled job in the public and private sector. And it has mean 0, so effectively it can be positive or negative. So you can think about it as maybe the best paying job is in the private sector, skilled job, but and I'm educated, but it's far away. It's in a different I have to commute, or it's 2 hours away from home. It's just very costly to get it, and it just lowers the value of that job. So what this creates is the idiosyncratic values or costs for different jobs, and what will give you is a sorting mechanism. But what it means is if two jobs have very similar wages, then you just roughly 50-50. As a job is much more costly, then fewer people are going to take it. So what this makes is, if you don't have this, you have a bang. So for example, if the government pays 1% less than the public sector, than the private sector, then no one goes to the government. If the government pays 1% more than the private sector, everyone goes to the government. So what it creates, it's just, it's a way to make it, instead of a bang, it makes more continuous sorting mechanism. So the Walrasian private sector is just a 101. So wages equal marginal productivity in the private sector. So but here the important point is that the wages in the private sector are going to respond, as in the usual model, on the relative supply of workers. But now the difference from a regular model is that the government is there. It's not just, you know, how many college workers there are, but how many college workers that are not working for the government. Okay, so the public sector has to produce a minimum level of government services, and these are exogenous. So this is, you know, if you live in Norway, you want to provide a lot of government services. If you live in the US, you want to provide less. It just comes from the outside. The choice here is the skill mix, which workers to hire. So the other thing that comes from the outside is these wages in the public sector. So they come from, when we say exogenous, it just means that they come from outside of the labor market. In the baseline, we do take them as exogenous. In the extension, we have a wage determination that depends on union power. Union prefers to have more compressed wages, for instance. But really, for the essence of the argument, we just take it as exogenous, and then we match them to the data. So the choice, this is a model about the skill mix choice of the government. Do I want to hire how many college workers with college, and how many workers without college? So it's very simple, but here there's the subtlety that we have to distinguish the optimal skill mix, what the government wants, from what the government can end up having. So if unconstrained by supply, the government would do this program, would just minimize the costs of providing this public sector good. We have an alternative where you want to maximize the provision of goods subject to a budget constraint, but essentially they are very, very similar, and you have a first order condition that tells you how many workers you hired from college and without college, and these will depend on the technology, so beta, but also on this wage ratio. So here is where the wage compression is going to tilt the type of workers you want to hire. And then there is a market clearing, and here the only thing is that for the college workers, they'll either be employed in skilled jobs, public and private, or they'll be underemployed in the public and private. So this total underemployment is U. And here is how to trick this variation of the Roy model, that the top workers have 4 choices. And this is if they aren't constrained. If they could choose their best, their best option, they could either go to the public and private in skilled jobs, or they would be underemployed either in the public or the private. And here it's where we have to think about this rationing. So if the government is paying very high wages, it means that it's very attractive option. So many workers want to go, more than the number of jobs. And then it means that jobs would be rationed, in the sense that there are 10 positions, 20 people want to get in. So we don't want unemployment to complicate the model. So the idea is, if the government doesn't hire them, then they go back to their second best choice. So some people, 10 people get a job, 10 people don't get it, and then they didn't get their first option, they'll go to their second best option. And then a low public wage, it's the opposite. So fewer workers have their first choice to work in the government, in skilled jobs, because the government is not paying enough. So the government is constrained. So it means employment is determined by supply. So the government has 10 jobs, wants to hire 10 people, but then just only five want to come. And so we can think about the actual number of public sector workers will be the minimum between the demand and supply. And what we'll have different regimes. One where it's determined by demand when the government is paying high wages, or it's determined by supply when it's not. So for low educated workers, there's only two choices: working in the private, and you have this value, the pecuniary, the wage, and this other value or cost of getting that job, or going to the public. And again, you'll have the same, either the wages are too high and too many people want to get into the government. So think about Italy, where 85,000 people want to get these 30 jobs, and these are ration jobs, or with a low public wage, and then few workers want to come in. So because the model is very simple, we can do a lot of analytical work. It's very useful to define what is this threshold wages, which effectively would be the market clearing wage. So these are the cutoffs that will tell us whether we are in which regime. This would be if the market was Walrasian, for a given number of workers that the government wants to hire, this is how much it would need to pay for the markets to clear. And then if we are above, we'll be in a regime, and if we are below, we'll be in a different regime. So actually we can define 4 regimes. I can show you visually here. One where you see the red dot, that would be when you calibrate the model, that's the regime 1, when the government is paying higher wages than the market clearing. And then is demand determined. The government chooses the skill mix, and then there's always people that want to enter the government. But then what you see, if the government cuts a lot the skilled wages, then you go to regime 2. In regime 2, the government wants to hire more skilled workers, but they don't want to come to the government. So then for the government to maintain the provision of public sector goods, it's out of the ISO quants. So it doesn't get enough skilled workers. It has to compensate with more unskilled workers. Okay, and then if the government really cuts austerity to the limit, then what happens? We go to regime 4. It's a regime where the government gets whoever wants to come, and basically can't provide the goods and services. This G bar. So you can think about this public sector as breaking down. Okay, and then just to the model, it's very simple. It ends up being for regime 1, 3 equations to 3 unknowns. So underemployment, wage, and the wages in the private sector that you can further substitute. So it boils down to 1 equation to 1 unknown. So it's very easy to prove that the equilibrium exists and is unique.
Sorry, Pedro, to interrupt.
Yeah.
I guess you have a few minutes to wrap up.
Okay, so I'll just yes. So we do some analytical work, but then what we do is the quantitative part. So we bring the model to the data. We do just a slight variation of the model, but in essence, you have 7 parameters, and you have 7 targets that are all data that you had before that we discussed. And here we target the underemployment rate in the economy. That's the parameter of the weight on this non-pecuniary value. We don't target the underemployment rate in the public and private sector, and we do a good job in matching those. But so just 2 exercises. One is decomposition. So you have here the column of the data, and our statistic, the ratio of public employment shares and the ratio of education intensity. And we target that for the baseline. And then we do two exercises. One is just, we equate the public sector wages to the private sector wages. So we decompress the wages in the public sector, and that brings underemployment rates of the two sectors to be the same. So in that case, we go 15%. So we can explain 50% of this public education bias. When we equate both wages and technology, then we get to this symmetric world where it's the ratio would be 1. So I don't know. I think always when you have decompositions, I think 15% is quite large. So then what we do next is trying to understand what are the consequences of this, of the fact that the wages in the public sector are not really, matching the private sector. And here is just looking at elasticities of wages in the private sector. How do wages in the private sector respond to the wages in the public sector? And here, if you see the first set of numbers is the elasticity of the private sector wages. The first one is the skilled and the second one is the unskilled with respect to the unskilled public sector wages. So this is the exercise. I'm going to raise the wages at the bottom of the unskilled public sector workers. What happens in the private sector? So what happens is that actually inequality goes up. Why? Because it's this adjustment of the type of workers the government hires. The government won't want to hire so many unskilled uneducated workers because now they are relatively more expensive. So it just switch. It prefers to hire workers with more education. So what happens in the private sector? There's going to be a shortage of skills that will be absorbed by the government, and there's going to be an excess unskilled. And on top of that, there's going to be an effect through underemployment. But in the end, what you see is this, that you reduce the inequality in the public sector, you actually increase it in the private sector because of this, the incentives of which workers to hire. And in the quantitative exercise, and I'll kind of wrap up here. In the quantitative exercise, the model is in regime 1. So the government doesn't have any problems recruiting, and the problem is, if any, that it's paying too high wages and they are too compressed. So it alters the skill mix. But we think that this idea of a regime 2, a regime where some types of workers the government has difficulties in hiring, and this goes along with a paper by Borjas that documented these changes in the wage structure in the public and private sector. And what he said is the wage structure in the public sector becomes relatively more compressed. The public sector found it harder to recruit and retain high-skilled workers, and that's the idea that the wage inequality has been increasing in the private sector, and it wasn't accompanied in the public. But with this comes an impact on the type of workers that the government can hire. Now, because we calibrated the model to college and non-college, we don't really see that because the government can still hire workers with college. But we do have in an appendix a version with thinking about the skilled as people with MSc and PhD. And there we see that we are close to this, we are actually in regime 2 where the government might have difficulties hiring. So the model is very simple, but it's to make a point, and then you can apply it to different levels of heterogeneity. So this is it. So I just want to kind of summarize well the results you've seen. So there's this. The wage and excess underemployment explain 50% of the education bias, but I think the substantial point that you can take is that we should really think about setting the right wage in the public sector, and we haven't thought much about it for many years. The literature was very big in the 70s. Then it kind of came down in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, but now surely with the COVID, it just puts more attention, and yeah, we should definitely think more about how the government sets the wages and try to get the right wage, and the right wage is one that's not too high to generate queues for public sector and basically having the government overpaying, but it's also not too low meaning that the government can't hire the type of worker that he needs. So I'll stop here, and I'm sure there will be more questions, and then I can also come back to some of the questions that people asked, that some other issues. So okay. Go ahead with questions.
Thank you very much. So yes, we have some questions in the Q&A. So first, I think Arnab had a question about the extreme value error distribution. Arnab, if you want to raise your question.
It was really a clarification. So maybe I got this wrong. I thought you were assuming the mean of an extreme value distribution to be 0, which is not the case, but it does not really affect your thinking in this respect. So the mean will obviously be positive because you are choosing the better out of the two options.
No. So the mean of the distribution. So in the end, yeah, you'll always choose the highest value. But then, so you'll draw from a distribution for each of the 4 options. And why is it this extreme type 1 value distribution? Because in the end, it's always a comparison of differences between error, the value in one job versus the other, and this will have a logistic distribution. So that's why it just gets you functional forms. But you're absolutely right. Then it's you'll always go to well, you might actually get a negative error, but as long as all the other, the value for the other 3 options are worse. So this is just analogous to the econometrics, to the multinomial logit model. So it's kind of the same math.
Yes. So yeah, no, I get that. Yeah. For a moment, I was put off track, imagining you were saying that the mean of this extreme value distribution would be 0, which is not the case. It always needs to be positive. But anyway, okay. I get your point.
I don't know if there are more questions from the attendees.
So I cannot raise my hand, but I would like. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I have a couple myself, but I'm happy to leave you the floor, Athanas.
Oh no, okay. Well, so I want to kind of. There's a lot to unpack here, and I think you had a lot of interesting results. So the first point I want to make is about kind of the motivation of the paper and all the results that you showed us, right? So initially you started with various data points that kind of show you the relationship between public, private sector, and so on. But I wanted to kind of just get the response. Isn't it in fact the relative size of the public sector that would really matter in this setting? I mean, you had so US and Europe would be very different in that sense, and they probably would respond very differently to a technology shock. I mean, as we can also see now. They also respond very differently to a health shock, right? In the way they adjust. The wage premium and the wage compression that happens in those two also would depend on union structure, right? I mean, in the US you have a very different prevalence of unions in public-private sector as opposed to Europe. And in this regard, I mean, it seems like in the motivation that there was very little space left for thinking about how private sector actually impinges upon the public sector behavior, right? So the compression can occur the other way around, in fact, and it kind of dominates that. So maybe in the UK you have only the unions can act actually to impinge upon the wage structure, but it could be the other way around. So it might be that might be important. And a final point, just before going to the model.
I'm scared. I didn't bring paper, and I'm scared I'm going to forget. So if I can answer, and then you can come back to the
okay. Well, yeah. Okay, that's fine.
I don't know. It's no, because these are it's a very important point that public sectors around, in developing economies, they are very different, and they produce different goods. They have different hiring procedures. So some do entry exams, some others don't. There's different policies, different weights of unions. Now, when we went to data of US, UK, France, and Spain, it was exactly with that in mind, that even if you have very different countries with all these different, the production, the type of goods it produced, education or health, in some are produced or not, but still the facts are still there, namely this education bias. So it just means that it's something intrinsic to the public sector, and it can't. It's not only driven by these other things that are definitely different.
So one way to think about this education bias is think of the NHS in the UK. Okay, it kind of dominates everything in terms of to the extent that it basically minimizes the effect of private sector provision of health services. Okay, and so they're the monopsonist here, and they can offer any price to hire the best and the brightest that are coming out of the education sector. Doctors and nurses and so on, and so in that sense, I mean, the premium goes to these guys, right, to some extent, and it's very difficult to think of how the private sector can actually take this education bias away. I mean, talking about the model, and I wanted to kind of say a few things about this, but I mean, the how much you explain would depend very much on the data that you're using to match the model, right? Because in some sense, you're doing the US and you explain about 12% of that education bias can be, different exactly because the provision of goods and services is very different across these different sectors. I mean, the size matters, right? And so, you can think of the extreme case scenario, wartime economy would provide a very different set of goods and services in the public sector as opposed to the private, and that changes depending on technology shocks, right, or other shocks, and so anyway, I mean that was kind of, I think.
So we do for other countries, European countries, and we do explain more. So this wage, especially this wage compression, explains more in Spain, because there is higher underemployment and you have much higher wage compression. But so that's the thing. I had many things to answer, and I'm forgetting. But one point, I think it's so this model is about the composition of employment. The other question that you ask is about what determines employment in the first place. So why is it 16% in the US and 30%? So this was a question that was mainly very popular in the literature in the 70s. Where people looked since the Second World War and saw public employment increasing as a share, and they were wondering why. So kind of, papers by Buchanan and Musgrave, they thought a lot about this. And so I know that you worked on issues of privatization. And so in here, there is some element of politics,
political economy,
political economy and references of societies. No, so Nordic countries, they want to. So I think that part we can help, or I can help a little bit less. So you have all these theories. If the private sectors are monopolists or low competition, it should be done by the public sector. If it's difficult to monitor, you should do in-house. If the private sector can reduce costs, you should do it in the private sector. So there's all these theories. And so I take that as the first step. That's given. That's not my question. My question is, after you decide what you want to provide, that's the question of which workers you want to try to hire. The second point is about the wage compression, where it comes from. And that's another question that I don't answer, because there are many different possibilities. So from the unions, but you see, in Norway and Nordic countries, the unions are very important, but there it's where the public sector wage premium is lower, it's negative, and it's where you have least wage compression. But it could be political economy issues, and the issue that you pointed out that I think it's very important is just the fact that the public sector sometimes it's not about a deliberate policy, but it's just because, you know, things are moving very fast in the private sector. With technology, you know, robots, that's kind of skill bias technological progress that's kind of increasing the college premium. And in the public sector, it just can't react as fast. And the wage compression might just be generated by that, that the top ones that are being benefited in the private sector, it's just not accompanied in the public sector. So it's the other question that I don't answer. You know, it's not the purpose of the paper to explain where it comes from. It's saying there is an element of policy in the wages, and the governments can affect them. But I just take them from the data and I see the implications. And I see the implications exactly to highlight that we should think where these, there are still an element of policy, and we should think, we should think very carefully about that.
Okay, so there is a question in the Q&A which I would let people take up. I think Christina has a few questions. I had a couple of questions on the model, but you know, given that our tea and coffee starts in just a couple of minutes, I will let these proceedings go ahead, and then maybe we can discuss that over tea. So
okay.
Christina.
So Chris, maybe you want to go ahead with your question.
Christina, please you go ahead with your questions. I've asked a couple already, so
okay. So the first question I wanted to ask actually is a remark that you mentioned already before when you talk about the wages in the public sector, and you mentioned the fact that it's kind of difficult to quantify wages because there is a component that is benefits. And I wanted to stress the fact that indeed this component is quite large, and sometimes is as large as the wage, particularly for high-skill jobs. So when you present this negative premium for college degree workers in public jobs, I take it a little bit with some grain of salt, because there is this component which is very large that somehow compensates for the fact that the basic salary might be a little bit lower. And also I was kind of surprised to see that when you presented the statistics in the beginning, you show this negative premium, but then, if I'm not mistaken, when you calibrate the model, then you get a positive wage premium for college graduates in the public sector. So I wanted to ask you about this.
Okay. So
result.
So the data is the same. So in the estimations, so to answer your question, in the estimations, we do one where we control for occupation, and one we don't, and we use the statistics. Sorry, I'm way down. I have there's many extensions of the model. The model is very simple, so you can think. Sorry, I have the problem with I didn't have the paper. So the first question on that there's these non-pecuniary or other aspects that, because in the model you only have this naive wage comparison, you are not really considering. And you say it's very high for the high skilled workers, and I do think it is definitely. But then there are many these other compensating benefits. There are others, and I think I mentioned the most important ones on my end is the job security, and the job security benefits especially the unskilled workers, because they are the ones that in the private sector they benefit, they have higher risk of unemployment. So if you put job security, it would bias, it would tilt even more the compensation. And for example, in the US, there is a lot on the healthcare that in many private jobs, they are not they are very risky and they don't have health insurance, and in the public you always have. But also so there are other benefits. So I understand yours, and it's true. And the one that was mentioned, the revolving doors of politicians that might benefit some people at the top, but then there are others that might benefit at the bottom. From my research is in practice, these should all be factored in. And when you have a search model, you compare the values of jobs, not the wages of jobs. And the values include all bunch of other things. And that's what you should do when you actually go. But there are many dimensions, and in the model is an abstraction, so it just comes to as the wage summarizing all the differences. In practice, you would really want to have all these components being factored in. Sorry, I'm way down into the slides, but we did use the college premium that we estimate in the data. It's positive for both college and non-college. It's 8% at the bottom and 1% at the top. In the initial data that I showed you was when I divided into these 9 education categories. And when you go to these very fine categories, that's when you can see that the premium for the PhDs are in minus 10. So these people are still going to the public sector. So there are clearly other things that they value to go there. But very well. Other questions?
Chris, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm a little less certain with this question, so please forgive me if my understanding here isn't quite right. I believe that you said that one of your main results from the quantitative exercises that you conducted was that raising or adjusting the relative wage levels for skilled and unskilled workers would, through the kind of more general market effects, would raise inequality in the private sector. And so I wonder if the kind of conclusion from that exercise, or a conclusion from that exercise that you could draw, is that the premiums that are set as are set on purpose. They're a direct consequence of societal choices that we make because we believe that. In other words, is this a direct a measure through which governments affect inequality and attempt to control it? Is that? Do you think that's a conclusion that you could draw from that?
Yeah. So what happens is you reduce inequality in the public sector, and the consequence is increasing inequality in the private. And
sorry.
It's the opposite. So you try to reduce inequality in the public sector, but then how it happens is that if when you reduce inequality, then so suppose that you offer always the same wage for a person with college and a person without college, just for the thought experiment. If you are in a department, the government in the department, who do you want to hire if you are going to pay the same wage?
Mm-hmm.
You are going to hire someone with college, naturally, because you are, and because of that, you don't hire anyone without college. So what it means, you are taking from the private sector, you are taking out of the market the people with college, and you are putting people without college, and that's when you have with the production function that translates into increasing wages in the private sector. So that's the mechanism, and we think it's first order importance, and it's kind of surprising, that. And that's where you think we do, and it's been documented. So there's a paper by Alessina in 2000, where he argues that the wages and employment in the public sector are used as a way to redistribute resources to minorities and to different groups. He has the case of Italy. It says it's redistribution from north to south of Italy. So there is this idea that the governments might be using it to redistribute resources, and it might be very well explained why the wages are so compressed in the public sector. the unions push for this. But then what I'm saying is that there are very clear general equilibrium consequences, and it only relies on one assumption. All models are always based on particular assumptions, but you can just say, is the government adjusting the type of workers that it hires? And it's the question that you ask that within your department, let's say you are in a university, so very close up to the sphere of the public sector, or if you think about different departments and institutes of the public sector, whether you look at the table with the schedule of wages to decide which people to hire. And the more compressed it is, then obviously you would want to hire the better worker. If it's just to pay 100 quid more, then you'd hire someone with higher education, and then you shun the people, and you get the best people. But then, are you getting the right people for the job? That's the question. So I don't know if it's taking too long, and then maybe we can join for the coffee. I think
there's more questions. Arnav has raised his hand, but I suggested maybe we move to the other room in the other Zoom link, and we continue there. Thank you very much for your presentation, Pedro, and thank you very much to all of you for attending. And I see you soon.
Pleasure. So I'll see you in a bit.
In a bit. All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone.